everyone. Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Masterclass number 15 of Practical Cities. Our discussion today is going to be on form-based approach, discussing a new paradigm in regulating urban development in terms of built form and their governing regulations. Also, an important announcement for all the young students and professionals out there. We've received multiple requests from you on our social media platforms and have extended the deadline for the submission to showcase your research work and thesis capstone projects till December 28th. So do take full advantage of this and all the best. And in case you have any other details, you can access our website at practicalcities.com.
This brings me to introduce our speaker for the day, urban planner and designer Jignesh Mehta. Jignesh Mehta is a senior urban planner and urban designer with more than 20 years of international experience in both public and private sectors, working on large-scale urban planning and urban design projects in America, in India, in Bhutan, and various other countries. During his practice, Jignesh sir has led and worked on various significant projects, winning national award from the American Planning Association and the HUDCO National Design Award. Jignesh sir's area of work range from development plans, master plans, and local area plans to transit-orient developments, development regulations, form-based regulations, and urban design projects. Some of the significant projects that Jignesh sir has led and worked on include the development plan of Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority, a Mochu development plan for Kunchiling, Bhutan, Regional Framework Plan 2040 for Chicago, TOD for California high-speed rail stations, Mumbai Port Complex Master Plan, Canal Front Development for Himmatnagar, street design, flyover, and underspace design for municipal corporations, etc. Jignesh sir has spent about 12 years in USA before returning to India, where he worked on various planning and urban design projects in places such as Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., LA, Sacramento, Detroit, Dubai, Bhutan, etc. Jignesh sir is currently leading projects for improving LAP, TPS, and DP mechanisms in Indian cities. He is also an advisor and mentor for heritage precinct improvements and other projects such as the Mahila Housing Trust over the past few years. Jignesh sir is currently the program chair for the Master of Urban Planning at CEPT University and has been involved in academics at the Faculty of Planning, CEPT University since 2013. Jignesh sir holds a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Illinois at Chicago, USA, and a degree in architecture from CEPT University, Ahmedabad. A very warm welcome to you, Jignesh sir, on our platform of Practical Cities. We are very thankful for you to have graced this masterclass today.
Thank you, Anakshi. This is very elaborate introduction, and I think it's very flattering. But thank you, and I'm as excited as probably you to be on this masterclass. It's a great initiative by all young professionals like you, and I think it will go a long way in building up the future of many young professionals. So once again, thanks for inviting me here. Today we are going to talk about built form regulations and form-based approach for Indian cities. And this is a very interesting topic since the way Indian cities have been growing, the kind of urban patterns and urban form that is emerging, what is it reflecting, and how have those patterns come up? So let's just try and understand that with a little bit of background. I would start with saying that land is a very limited resource, and especially urban designers, planners, they deal with land. So you have to deal with it in a very careful manner because it is limited. It is important to understand that how efficiently the urban land is utilized in Indian cities, and if not, why. So let's begin with understanding what kind of urban patterns and what kind of land utilization Indian cities have. Generally, it is assumed that Indian cities are chaotic because of high density, and allowing more built area and FAR would add more density and chaos. Hence, FAR should be restricted in cities. This is generally the argument that planners would make to say that let's not go with higher FAR. Let's not increase the density, and let's keep the development limited. So in this context, it is important for us to answer few questions. One is, how efficiently is the urban land utilized in Indian cities? If we are saying that adding more people would make it very chaotic, is it really utilized to its fullest extent? Can we really not add any more population? Is it really filled up to its edges? So that's the first question. The next one is, what kind of urban form and character does it result in? Our cities and our urban patterns, what kind of urban form and character does it result in? And how to improve land utilization in our cities? So if we take these questions, one of the studies that we ended up doing was looking at various cities like Ahmedabad, like Mumbai, and see what kind of urban patterns we have and what kind of land utilization we have. So these multiple squares that you see are different areas that were studied to understand the land utilization. So just an example here, this is Ahmedabad's central area, the Ashram Road. And if you look at that area, and if you see the area that is covered under building footprints versus the area that is under private domain versus the area that is under public domain. And you will see in that pie chart that almost 57% of the area is under private open space. Only 26% of this area is under building footprint. And only 17% is in public streets and public open spaces. So if you see how well our cities, our urban patterns are utilizing the urban land, there's only 26% is really built and 70% in public domain. The other 57% in this area is in private open spaces. The other areas of Ahmedabad, for example, Bhopal, and again, if you see the breakup, it's almost 48% in private open spaces, 36% under building footprints, and 16% in streets and public open spaces. Another one, Bodakdev, these are all relatively newer areas, but again, you see the percentage breakup, more or less the same, 53% in private open spaces, 31% under building footprints, and 16% under streets. Science City, again, same story. So essentially, if you see, what's really happening is that our urban land, how well it is utilized, almost 50% or more is generally within the private open spaces, and the other half is divided in built and usable public open spaces like streets and green spaces. Similar story if you see other cities like Mumbai. This is Lower Parel, and if you convert that into the same diagrams, you see almost 49% as private open spaces. In fact, in this area, the street percentage is even lower. There are large blocks, and you see that only 12% of the area is under streets, and virtually almost no public open spaces. There might be private open spaces, but no public open spaces. And 39% is built. And you see, if you know this area, generally you will see there are some really newer developments, high-rise development, but then there are some industrial sheds, and there are also some informal settlements. So all that combined makes this 39%. Nariman Point, which is the more organized area. But again, if you see the pattern of land utilization, it's 54% private open spaces, and here you see relatively more amount of space in public open is 24%. BKC, similar story. Ballard Estate is one a bit different. It is an older area, but this is where you see 36% is built, 38% is private open, and 27%, which is relatively higher, in public open spaces. So essentially what I mean to say is that when you start looking at how urban land is utilized, you start realizing almost 50% or more area is in those private open spaces. And we'll talk more about that. But compared to that, if you see some of these cities abroad, for example, this is downtown San Francisco, and you will not find much of private open space at all. Most of the space, most of the land area is covered by either built or by streets and green spaces, which are all utilizable by people. Similarly, Paris, again, more than 50% is built, 34% in public open, and only 10% in private open. Then those spaces are also in the rear of the buildings of the, either they are courtyards or somewhere in the backyard. Barcelona, again, if you see the pattern. So, and then also the eastern example, Hong Kong, the Mongkok area. Again, almost 50% is public open, primarily in streets, because here the block sizes are very narrow. The block sizes are very small, and the street area is much bigger. So the question is, how efficiently urban land is utilized in Indian cities? As we said, approximately 50% or more land remains under private open space in the areas that are even recently developed, actually. These private open spaces are cut up in multiple small slivers in margins with compound walls and other encroachments. And most frequently, they are covered with illegal, temporary, or permanent structures or plains, etc. So generally, they end up being not really efficiently used. The resulting urban patterns have inefficient use of land with encroached margins, compound walls, incoherent and unintentional built form. So what has caused such urban patterns in Indian cities? And the answer lies in the DCRs, the Development Control Regulations. And it's the Development Control Regulations, they govern this private open spaces. And these are those regulations, if you see, ground coverage, margins or setbacks, common plot requirements, thick plantation requirements, margin between buildings that are required, internal roads, parkings, all these elements. Some of them are important, some of them are critical, some of them are not. But all these combined together really impact the private open space, the requirement for private open space. So the question is, why such regulations? They are commonly accepted as standard practice without much questioning. They are based on certain underlying assumptions, which are never made explicit, nor are they based on any empirical studies or evidences. So what I would like to do is to question some of these underlying assumptions and see whether do we really need these kind of regulations, or can we change them and keep only the ones that are necessary and get rid of the ones that are not necessary to improve the urban form of our Indian cities. Okay. There are a few underlying assumptions. One, for example, ground coverage regulations provide much required open space in our cities. And it's an assumption. A lot of people would generally believe it's true, but we need to really think about it. The next one is about margins. Margins are required for fire safety. Another assumption, margins result in addition of green spaces. Margins and ground coverages are must for air and ventilation. Margins are required for parking. Common plots are required for community gathering and play areas. Now let's just go one by one. Ground coverage regulations provide much required open spaces in our cities. However, in reality, such open spaces are cut up in multiple small slivers of land, generally remaining underutilized or illegally utilized. And you must have seen many of such examples in your cities also. But as we saw, this is again one of the areas where almost 57% of the land area, the really urban service land area, is underutilized, is in the private open spaces. So the question is, do we really, is this really an efficient use of land? or can something change? And generally, these kind of patterns have also come up is because of the ground coverage requirement. So most of our cities, generally, when you look at the regulations, they will say you cannot utilize your plot area more than 40% of your plot area, or more than 30% of your plot area, depending on the plot size and depending on the building height. These regulations vary in different cities, and these regulations are generally there in all major cities: Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad. They all generally have these kind of regulations about uh, how much ground coverage you can have. And as we said, once again, the urban pattern of San Francisco, and there's no such requirement, ground coverage requirement. Whatever is your plot area can be built. There's no requirement of front margin, side margin, no ground coverage, and that's when you start seeing these kind of real high land utilization. And someone may think that these such dense land utilization may result in bad urban form, but when you go there and see, that's not the case. They are all really nice areas, really lively areas, really active, economically vibrant. People would love to go there and sit there and enjoy. Second assumption: margins are required for fire safety, and this is the big argument generally uh, the conventional planners would have, especially when you start talking about reducing margin requirement. In reality, it is almost impossible for fire safety vehicles to enter the margins due to various reasons. And this is where you have to really think that the margins that are provided, sometimes it's 9 meters margin or 8 meters or 6 meters requirement for fire safety vehicles to go in. But what really happens in those margins? And you see, most often they are covered with this kind of plinths or level differences, or also sometimes the other elements like basement and trees and other structures. And also this is front margin, for example, of a newer mall, and they have raised the whole plinth area. So this margin now, how would you bring a fire safety vehicle here? So that argument also does not really hold. In fact, buildings without front or side margins can provide better access for firefighting. And you see, this is Barcelona. You don't see any front margins, right? And also, if you see, there are about 6 to 8, 9-storied buildings here. And such buildings can be very easily accessed by fire vehicles, fire safety vehicles, or the firefighting vehicles. Rescues can also be very easy. So I would say it's a wrong assumption to make, to say that we need front margins for fire safety. So some other visuals. The other assumption people end up making: margins result in addition of green spaces. In reality, only a few of these margins result in green spaces. Generally, they are all covered, paved for different purposes, primarily for generally parking purposes. And you would find very little green space in these areas. Okay. And for various reasons, they would pave it over, either for parking or maybe so that the dust problem is reduced, or sometimes some people say greenery brings mosquitoes and other things, so they end up paving it over. So in fact, if these margins are combined into a single common space, instead of having them in front or side, if they're combined into a single common space, it will result in much larger, easily accessible and more usable green spaces. And you can see some very good examples. This is Barcelona block. You don't see any front margins, you don't see any side margins, but all those spaces, all that land area is collected as a common open space, which can be used by everyone. And it can be beautiful. Some other cities, So another assumption people end up making, margins and ground florages are must for light and ventilation. In reality, cities all over the world, including India, have been built without requiring margins or restricting ground coverages, and they have no problem of light and ventilation. And this is the so-called the front facade of city of Chicago, the Michigan Avenue, and these are all old old high rises, new high rises, and you can see where are the margins, and still all of these buildings work very well. There are different ways of getting light and ventilation, and in Western cities, more often now they use air conditioning, but also the older buildings had the atriums and also the ventilation from the front and the rear. These are some of these older patterns where it's only the front and the rear is where, and also we have the examples of Indian cities. Delhi's urban patterns, or if you look at Jaipur, for example, old cities, and most of our old cities, they didn't have side margins. Old city Jaipur, old city Ahmedabad, all the pole houses, or you see any other such old cities. So essentially what I meant to say was that there are various different ways, and you don't have to have margins for those things. There are different ways in which you can deal with it. The next assumption is margins are required for parking. And a lot of times that's why people say, no, we have to have margins. No, we have to have front margins because otherwise where would people park? So in reality, margin spaces remain a lot of times vacant, inaccessible for vehicles, and underutilized in a lot of cases. And this is another example where the front margin, the roadside margin, generally the plan would be passed showing that people will be able to park their vehicles in the front margin, and therefore it goes to satisfy the parking requirement. But then you end up seeing that all the vehicles are parked on road. And similar is the cases in a lot of places. Next one is common plots. Common plots are required for community activities and for children to play, which is true. Now, common plots are required for community activities and children to play. But very often, these spaces are also encroached by parking, number one. But also, if you see a lot of these regulations, they require common plots for even commercial buildings. And now this is where there is no real requirement for common plot. All that you really need is an area for just people to come out and maybe just loiter around, maybe have lunch. But otherwise, large common plots may not be really required for commercial building. So again, the way to think about would be that what's the use for which you are asking for common plots. And you can see some visuals. This is what generally end up happening in the common plot. So these observations really reveal that a lot of these observations are not accurate. I would not say they are absolutely incorrect, but a lot of times they require questioning. And that's what we need to do. And we need to figure out what kind of regulations we need to have where to achieve the right urban form and the right urban environment. Okay. So how can we really improve the regulations? Our current development patterns are a result of conventional approach to zoning and regulations. Is there another approach? And the answer to that is yes. There is a conventional approach, which is pretty much a rule-based approach, but also then there is a form-based approach. And that form-based approach is derived considering the ultimate outcome of urban form. And based on that, everything is identified. So let's just quickly go through one by one. Generally, conventional rule-based approach would define regulations based on permissible uses and FSIs rather than desired built form and urban character. we all know the zoning and the regulations the way it is done in our cities, and generally when such plans are prepared, generally the urban form, the ultimate urban form, is not really the focus. The main focus is, how many people will come and live here, and whether we'll have sufficient infrastructure, and whether we'll have sufficient urban amenities and all that. Yes, all those things are necessary, but also more critical is the urban form. And these are the examples of conventional rule-based zoning and regulations. All of our current regulations are more or less this conventional patterned regulations. The rule-based regulations include rules for margins, heights, common plots, parking, FSI, etc., which all vary based on either plot size or road width or different types of zoning. And when you actually start putting all these regulations together, it's very difficult to really imagine what kind of urban form would come out of it. Okay. The complex interaction between these multiple rule-based regulations result in unpredictable, unharmonious built form. And you can see the same regulations, but that can result into all these different building types and building forms. So you can imagine a street with one set of regulations, but not having coherent built form. And that's what generally ends up happening. Now you don't have very clear street frontages, or the very clear urban patterns, different heights, different things. So the ultimate result is incongruent street frontages, chaotic street environment, and poor urban experience. You all know many of such places. And also it results into inefficient use of valuable urban land. Often it imposes unforeseen additional costs and impacts affordability. So compared to that, when you start looking at form-based approach, generally form-based approach it defines zones based on the desired urban form and character. It's not rule-based. It's considering first is the ultimate urban form, and also it identifies form through permissible building envelopes regulated by build-to-line, arcade, setbacks, heights, etc. Creates coherent street environment and rich urban experience, harmonious urban scale and form, provides better control over nature of streets and street character, and the urban experience allows incremental development without really compromising on the urban form and character. So when you have this form-based approach, regardless of which area is developing first or next, generally urban form remains coherent. It allows flexibility to deal with market fluctuations without really compromising on, again, the urban character. So let me just kind of go back to a little bit of background of how this urban form-based approach came up. It all began with people really realizing that the functional approach to city planning has really resulted into this very auto-oriented, car-focused cities. And this was a realization about 4 decades back, primarily in the Western countries, where people started realizing that our cities are actually made for cars and not really for people. It's very difficult for people really to walk and navigate through these cities. And also, not the city centers, but also the suburbs started becoming car-based. And it was almost impossible for a person to really get out of their home and just go walking to shop, or to school, or to satisfy, or to get anything really. So the approach really started. So people started exploring new approaches, and they realized that there are other ways of really planning your cities, which can be really pedestrian oriented instead of automobile oriented. And you can see these two patterns. The pattern in the north is more pedestrian friendly because it offers very easy walkable development, easy walk to shop, work, school, etc. Versus the lower part, it's completely auto oriented, because if you want to go from your home to shop, you'll have to simply get into your car and drive around, go to the main road, and then go into your mall. So that's the kind of pattern that uh, generally conventionally you have, versus the pedestrian oriented pattern that you need to achieve. And that really gave rise to the new urbanism, the movement. And what they started thinking about was the transact. The transact, which is not based on residential, commercial, institutional use, but it is based on the urban character. So they identify transact based on the real urban core zone. For example, would have high urban character, then urban center, you have general urban zone, suburban zone, then rural and natural. And based on that, various elements will be regulated. And the kind of environment that it would give rise to would be very, very pedestrian friendly. And you can see some of these, this area very, very clearly, if you can see my cursor. But this is the newer development based on the new urbanism principles versus the general suburb that you see around. And you can see the difference. And on ground, you start seeing the patterns where you have arcades, colonnades, also balconies overlooking the main streets. This is commercial part, but also the residential part would have similar elements. The porches and balconies would be opening on the street. The streets would have sidewalks which are walkable. This is another area. This is in San Jose. So there are these newer patterns where you generally will not see front margin or side margin. Will not really see parking in the margins. Parkings are generally managed on the street as short-term parking, and they are managed with appropriate parking fees. And then this whole idea started getting expanded from small neighborhoods to larger cities. So then slowly the cities also started looking at that as a desirable thing. And then they started planning some of their areas. I would not say the whole city would. It is still difficult for the city to change the regulations whole scale. But they started looking at different areas and started changing the regulations. So different zones would start having form-based regulations. And the influences also extended to India. So it's not just a Western concept now. Now slowly you start seeing such things in Indian context also. And this is Lavasa in Maharashtra. And Lavasa was also based on this concepts of new urbanism, where you start seeing the buildings aligned on the street, fronting directly on the streets with arcades, colonnades, all the balconies opening there. No front or side margin. Parking generally happens in the rear. Also, all the community spaces generally go in the rear. So there are the principles of new urbanism followed here. So what kind of regulations do you really need for coming up with such urban forms? And generally, if you see your conventional regulations, it would have a plan, which is a small report, or maybe a thicker report. But then attached to that would be rule-based regulations, some rules basically, without much illustrations. They are just simple rules that you have to read and follow, and you just keep flipping your pages from here to there to figure out exactly what is applicable to your plot. Versus when you talk about form-based approach, there are various elements of form-based approach. And first it would have the vision-based master plan, and that really envisions the urban form. And once the urban form is envisioned, there is also a zoning map, but that zoning map is form-based zoning map. So what kind of urban form should come where? And then there are form-based regulations, and I'll also share some of these form-based regulations. But they are primarily focused on what kind of building form and building typologies you would have in different zones. And then also there are guidelines. Those guidelines are really primarily for public spaces like streets and public open spaces. So combined, all these elements would form the form-based regulations. And some of the examples, if you see, and I'm just going to flip through that slide. But Miami, for example, they started changing their planning approach to form-based planning approach and form-based codes. In the US, the regulations are called codes. So they are called form-based codes. And here, particularly, I would draw your attention to the kind of terminology they end up using. So a conventional zoning document would have residential, low density residential, high density residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, those kind of, based on their uses, they would have the kind of zones. Versus here you start seeing suburban character, a general urban zone, urban center, urban core. Nowhere generally you will see use-based terminology, but they are all character-based terminology. And if you zoom in, also these zones are defined based on what kind of experience you would have on the street. So generally the same zone would be allocated on both sides of that street. And that's where you start seeing some of these zones, kind of longer zones. So same zone on both sides of the street. And then similarly, city of Cincinnati, they also explored the form-based codes, and they actually really organized it pretty well. And if you see, there are this various transacts. So T3, in T3 they have T3 estate, T3 neighborhood, T3 neighborhood with medium footprints. So there are various types that they have identified. But the first thing that they will talk about would be the kind of character, urban character that they would like to see. So first it starts with illustration. And then the next thing that they will talk about is the desired urban form. And then they will talk about other regulations like use, and they will also talk about the intent. And then they get into more details of the various elements that you would see on the street, from the street. And then they will also start talking about the height and parking and footprints and all of those things. So the idea here is that first, your main priority is the kind of urban form that is experienced by someone who is visiting or who is living in that area. And then there are other regulations. Also, they are all very well illustrated, as you see. So it kind of goes into details of that. In Indian context, now also there are very few examples in Indian context, but there are explorations. So one of those ones would be riverfront volumetric plan. If you see the Ahmedabad Riverfront Development Corporation and the plan that they have put in place, it's very much volumetric. And when I say volumetric, it really defines the permissible buildable building footprint, but permissible buildable area and permissible height up to which you can build. So it defines the volume instead of saying that you leave so much of margin and you leave so much of common plot and you leave so much of parking and this and that. All it is saying is that within this permissible volume, you can build whatever. And again, the components of that is that you have a plan and you have the regulations in text format and regulations with drawings. And it's the drawings that are very, very important. So you have the regulations which are very well illustrated. And if you can see, again, it's defining permissible building height, permissible building footprint, and permissible overall building envelope with some service volumes also on top. So there are those things very well identified. And then they would also have drawing. So each and every building footprint, permissible building footprint, is represented through a drawing, and it would clearly tell you how much you can build, up to what height you can build, and also what is your build to line. So if you can see it, for example, it would talk about 75% build to line up to 25 meters height. Then after that, you could have a setback or whatever. So this is a volumetric approach. It is not fully form based, but it is going towards form based. It is basically a form based approach in Indian context. And there are some volumes that are imagined there. The next one also in Gujarat now, they have a new local area plan mechanism, and all the LAPs are generally, the approach is more form based. I would not say again that they are fully form based. They are kind of a hybrid of form based and conventional approach. But as you see here, this is CBD, the proposed CBD of Ahmedabad. And again, what they really define is a permissible buildable volume. That's you see in the blue in the first graphic. And also they start identifying where you have to build to line and where you are supposed to have arcades. And these are the detailed drawings of that, very clearly identifying where you have to have build to line up to 50% or 100% build to line, where is no vehicular entry, where is the arcade requirement, and that's the permissible building footprints that are clearly identified. Also, and this is the last example, places like Bhutan, they also started experimenting with the form-based approach. And in fact, such places also found it very useful because of the traditional Bhutanese architectural code, which are also very similar. So they generally end up going hand in hand. The main purpose of the Bhutan architectural codes are also preserving and creating new development which are consistent with the current urban form of the area. So the form-based approach also generally would work very well. So I'll just quickly run through this another example. It's a city called Phuentsholing, which is a border town between Bhutan and India. And there's a new development being planned along the river Amochu. And here again, during the planning, the whole plan was conceived thinking about the new development in terms of what kind of urban character and what kind of urban form it would have. And based on that, then the zoning was identified and also the regulations were written. So this is the precinct map. They were not called zones, but they were called precincts. And you have various precincts called riverfront precinct, central area precinct, main street precinct, residential mixed use precinct. So again, you start seeing that they are not really use based, but they are character based terminology. And then each of those precincts would have specific regulations. And the regulations, and I'll just kind of browse through few of those regulations. But for example, riverfront precinct, first it would start with what kind of character, urban character you would like to have there. And then what are the permissible uses, but also then what are the minimum dimensions you could have for the plot. So no side of the plot shall be less than 24 meters. This is again to have certain urban character. And then in terms of setbacks, they're saying roadside setbacks, no roadside setbacks required. No front margin, no roadside setbacks. Side and rear setbacks, 3 meters. And also within a plot, if you're building 2 buildings, between that you need 6 meters. So that's your basic regulations related to ground coverage. And then permissible building envelope in terms of the height. So the margins really define the permissible building footprint. No front margin, only side and rear margin. And then you are permissible, you are allowed to build up to 22 meters in this particular zone. So that's the permissible building height and permissible buildable volume. And within that, then you have to also follow the Bhutanese architectural guidelines, Bhutan's architecture code. So that's where some of those elements like sloping roofs and wrap cells would come in. And that sloping roof also has a regulation of what angle it should be. So 11 to 18 degrees is should be the roof pitch. And depending on the height, your projections would vary from 1200 mm to 1800 mm. And based on that, then the overall built form would come up. Also, the multiple studies were done to define the height. So why you could not go beyond 22 meters. And generally it was thought that with the building proportions that they have, 22 meters is the ideal. Later on, there were also considerations about going higher, and in that case, the building footprint would become bigger. Also built to line, for example, and there's very strict regulations for built to line. At least up to 8 meters, you have to have that built to line. And generally after that, you can set back, but Bhutan's architectural code would not allow the setbacks. Instead, they require set front, meaning the projections in front, as per the architectural language there. And we'll talk about that. But what it requires is the arcade on ground level, and that arcade should be of minimum certain size, which is about what it was saying was arcade shall have fixed clear height of 4 meters, and arcade must have continuous width of 4.5 meters. So all this is to really govern the built form. And then you also have the permissible projection area. As I mentioned, Bhutanese architectural codes, they require wrap cells or step fronts. You know, they require projections, and there are also guidelines for projections. So in order to incorporate that, there is this 3 meters required, 3 meters of permissible area within which you can do the projection on street. So these kind of things are also added in, and there are various other regulations for each zone. So now the regulations are structured in such a way that you don't have to keep flipping your pages from back to front. For each precinct, you have all your regulations in that one single chapter. And then, so first you just simply identify where your plot is, which zone it belongs to, and then you will simply refer to those regulations. So those are few examples of form-based approach in our context, and I hope it's going to help the young planners, young urban designers.
It was indeed a pleasure to have you, sir, on our platform. I'm sure this has motivated a lot of young professionals who joined us today to take these learnings from the masterclass forward. And we hope that we all contribute to making our cities more livable and more sustainable. So,
thank you very much.
Also, a big thank you to all our viewers for joining us today, this evening. And we hope to see you all again next masterclass. Just a reminder again to all the students and the young professionals who would like to showcase their thesis and research capstone projects on our platform. Don't forget to take advantage of the extended deadline, which is 28th November. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. And see you all next class. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the motivation.